Germany, 1945. The war had ended, but hunger had not. Streets were filled with rubble instead of bread, and the scent of cooking had vanished from German homes. Families survived on thin soups made from boiled potatoes, bits of cabbage, and whatever could still be found in the ruins. Then, one morning, a strange sight appeared at the edge of a quiet town: American soldiers, moving carefully through the broken streets. Civilians watched in fear, expecting harsh orders or punishment. But what came next silenced everyone. The soldiers opened their field packs and began handing out food: loaves of white bread, cans of Spam, powdered milk, and even chocolate bars. To children who had been living on watery broth, it felt like a miracle. The aroma of real food filled the air for the first time in months. A soldier broke a piece of chocolate and offered it to a trembling child. The boy hesitated, then took it. That single act, the sharing of a soldier's ration, became more powerful than any weapon. In a land of ruins, food became the first language of peace. Stay with us, and subscribe to discover how American soldiers turned simple recipes into symbols of humanity, and how those meals helped rebuild trust after the darkest chapter in history. When the war finally ended, Germany did not feel victorious. It felt hollow. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne had turned into grey deserts of broken stone. Smoke drifted through the air, and the wind carried the smell of ash and metal. Churches stood roofless, windows shattered, streets littered with twisted bicycles and fallen chimneys. And beneath all that ruin lived the quietest and cruelest enemy of all: hunger. In every home that still had four walls, the same question hung in the air: what will we eat now? The war had stripped the land bare. Crops had burned in bombings, livestock had vanished, and railway lines that once brought food now ended in silence. The ration cards people clutched were worthless pieces of paper. Markets were empty except for wilted vegetables or black market traders whispering prices too high for anyone to pay. Mothers became chemists, inventors, and magicians all at once. They learned to stretch nothing into something. Wild herbs gathered from ditches became soup. Nettles, thistles, and even tree bark found their way into boiling pots. Sawdust mixed with a spoon of flour became bread so brittle it turned to dust at a touch. A single potato was sliced into thin circles to convince the children that dinner was enough. Some families learned to make ersatz meals: imitation coffee brewed from roasted barley or acorns, syrup made from sugar beets, and thin stews flavored only by salt water and memory. If a family was lucky, they traded a piece of fabric or jewelry for powdered milk from the black market. Every spoonful mattered. Every crumb felt sacred. Children wandered through rubble, searching for anything edible: half-burnt crusts, spoiled apples, the faint smell of something once cooked. They searched near railway yards and abandoned camps, hoping to find empty tin cans or the remains of army rations. Hunger made them fearless, but it also made them fragile and silent. Yet even in that emptiness, the thought of food was what kept many alive. At night, when the bombs no longer fell, families spoke softly about meals as if they were prayers. They remembered dumplings simmering in broth, loaves of bread baked before sunrise, the sweetness of jam spread across warm toast, and the sound of spoons tapping against ceramic bowls. Those memories filled their minds more than any real meal could fill their stomachs. The kitchen table, once the heart of every German home, became a symbol of loss and of hope. Even a single candle placed upon it meant that life, in some small way, still continued. Then, one morning, unfamiliar footsteps echoed through the streets. Boots! American boots! Soldiers were entering towns that barely existed anymore. People watched from broken windows, terrified of what the victors might bring. No one knew that the next chapter of their survival would begin not with orders, not with gunfire, but with bread. When the war finally ended, the sound of silence replaced the thunder of artillery. Villages that had once echoed with the march of boots now heard only the faint cry of hungry children. For many German civilians, surrender did not feel like peace. It felt like standing in ruins with no idea what tomorrow would bring. Then, the American troops arrived. Their tanks rolled slowly through the shattered streets, not as conquerors, but as strangers stepping into a world they had been taught to fear. The soldiers expected resentment, even hatred. Instead, they found faces hollowed by hunger, mothers clutching infants wrapped in torn blankets, and children with eyes too old for their age. Many of these soldiers had grown up in small American towns where food was shared and neighbors looked after one another. The sight of starving civilians was not what they had imagined when they were told about the enemy. What they saw in front of them was not an army, but families, broken, frightened, and desperate for a piece of bread. At first, the interactions were cautious. Villagers stood back as the convoys passed, whispering among themselves, unsure whether to approach. The Americans were equally uncertain. Every movement was slow, every word measured. But then, something changed. One soldier reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar. He handed it to a small boy who hesitated before taking it. The boy's face lit up, and for the first time, someone in that village smiled. That simple act began to melt years of hatred and fear. Soon, more soldiers followed, sharing canned meat, biscuits, and tins of soup. Children gathered around them, mothers offered thanks in trembling voices, and the air began to carry a new kind of sound, laughter. These early moments were not part of any military plan. There were no orders to feed civilians. It was pure instinct, humanity overpowering history. Through every loaf of bread and every shared meal, the Americans and Germans began to see each other not as enemies, but as people who had survived the same storm. In those quiet ruins, food became more than sustenance, it became a language of peace. And without realizing it, these soldiers were writing the first pages of a new chapter in post-war Europe, one meal at a time. The first real bridge between the American soldiers and the German civilians was built not with words, but with food. It began in small moments that carried enormous meaning. A soldier kneeling beside a child, opening his rucksack, and offering something simple yet precious, a Hershey chocolate bar. At that time, German children had forgotten the taste of sweetness. Sugar had vanished from their lives long before the war ended. When that first piece of chocolate melted on a child's tongue, it was more than candy. It was hope, in its purest form. Mothers stood nearby, holding back tears, unsure whether to thank the soldier or simply let the moment exist. Soon, other soldiers followed. They handed out sea rations, small cans of meat, biscuits, and chewing gum, the same rations that had kept them alive through the battlefields. The civilians accepted them with trembling hands, not just because of hunger, but because of disbelief. These were the same uniforms that had once represented fear, now offering food to feed their children. There was no official order to do this. No superior had commanded them to share. It came from something deeper, a sense of humanity that had survived despite the war. Soldiers who had once fought against these people were now kneeling in front of them, passing out rations one can at a time. The reactions were mixed at first. Some villagers watched from windows, still too afraid to approach. Others came closer, drawn by curiosity and hunger. But once a few children smiled, the entire atmosphere began to change. The soldiers laughed, the mothers nodded gratefully, and for the first time, both sides began to see each other not as enemies, but as survivors. Every small act, a piece of gum, a biscuit, a chocolate bar, carried the weight of peace. These were not grand gestures written in history books, they were quiet moments, born in the rubble of war. Yet they spoke louder than any treaty ever could. Through food, compassion took form. Through kindness, trust began to grow. And through these early exchanges, both the Americans and the Germans started to rebuild not only their towns but also their faith in humanity. Word of kindness travels faster than any command. Within days, neighboring villages began hearing about the American soldiers who were giving food to German children. Families who had lost everything walked miles just to see if the stories were true. In towns once filled with fear, something remarkable began to happen. Soldiers started carrying extra rations in their packs, not for themselves, but for the civilians they met. When a patrol stopped by a farm, they would trade canned beef for potatoes or share a loaf of army bread with an old woman who had nothing left but memories. Each exchange was simple, but each one meant survival. Food became the language of peace. There were no shared words between them, just gestures, smiles, and gratitude that spoke louder than translation ever could. Children began to follow the soldiers from a distance, giggling when one tossed them a tin of powdered milk or a stick of gum. To those children, it was not just food. It was friendship, wrapped in olive drab paper and sealed with kindness. The soldiers often thought of their own families back home, mothers who had packed their lunches, siblings who had waited for letters. They remembered their own small-town kitchens, the smell of cornbread or the warmth of a Sunday roast. That memory guided their actions. In giving food, they felt a sense of purpose that went beyond victory. They were feeding humanity itself. Meanwhile, the civilians began to respond in ways no one expected. Some villagers, despite their poverty, tried to return the gesture. They brought out old recipes, potato pancakes, barley soup, or thin rye bread baked over makeshift stoves, and offered them to the soldiers. It was all they had, but it carried the same message: thank you for remembering we are human. In those humble meals, centuries of division melted away. The act of sharing food turned the remnants of war into the beginnings of peace. Each bite, each smile, and each tear reminded both sides that compassion does not recognize borders. For the first time in years, the smell of cooking filled the air again. Not the smoke of battle, but the aroma of life returning. And in that fragile peace, both the soldiers and the civilians discovered something even stronger than survival, the taste of humanity itself. As the weeks passed, a quiet transformation spread across the ruined towns of Germany. What had started as brief exchanges of rations began to grow into something far more human: shared meals. Soldiers who once stood guard at checkpoints now found themselves sitting beside the very people they had been sent to fight. At first, it felt strange. The soldiers placed their rifles on the ground, unsure of the customs or the language. The villagers, too, hesitated. They had spent years being told that the men in those uniforms were monsters. But the moment bread was broken and passed from one hand to another, those barriers began to fade. Inside crumbling homes, tables were repaired with loose boards, and pots simmered over makeshift fires. The meals were humble: potato stew, cabbage soup, sometimes bread soaked in broth, but they were shared with genuine gratitude. The laughter of children began to echo again through walls that had once heard nothing but silence. Some of the soldiers wrote about these moments in letters home. They described mothers offering what little they had, even inviting them to sit and eat. They spoke of how these meals reminded them of their own families, their own towns, and how easy it was to forget, if only for a while, that a war had ever existed between them. Recipes were exchanged without words. German women showed the soldiers how to make barley soup thick enough to feed 10 people with almost nothing. In return, the soldiers introduced small pieces of American food culture: peanut butter, corn bread, and even powdered coffee, which became a rare delight for the villagers. Every meal told a story. Around those tables, they did not speak about battles or losses. They spoke with gestures, smiles, and laughter that carried no translation. Through food, they rebuilt trust, and through trust, they rebuilt hope. By late summer, some American outposts had become gathering places where civilians and soldiers dined together under open skies. For a few hours each evening, war seemed like a distant nightmare. The crackle of a campfire replaced the sound of gunfire, and the smell of soup replaced the smoke of burning towns. When enemies shared the same table, something extraordinary happened: they stopped being enemies. And in that fragile peace, a new kind of strength was born, one built not from power or victory, but from understanding. As life slowly returned to the ruins of post-war Germany, something unexpected began to bloom again: the art of cooking. For years, food had been about survival. Recipes were nothing more than scraps of memory. Families cooked whatever they could find, and flavor had vanished from their lives. But now, with the help of the Americans, taste began to return. Many of the soldiers carried ingredients that German families had not seen in years: flour, sugar, coffee, and even dried fruit. When they shared them, they did not just share supplies. They shared possibility. Women began to recreate the recipes they once learned from their mothers and grandmothers. Some baked bread again for the first time since the war began. Others made potato dumplings, cabbage rolls, or stews thickened with American flour. Children watched as kitchens came back to life. The smell of warm bread replaced the scent of smoke. For the first time in years, families gathered around tables not to ration, but to celebrate. Every dish felt like a piece of the old world returning, a reminder that even after everything had been lost, culture could still survive through food. The Americans, too, were fascinated. They tasted sauerkraut made with wild cabbage, soup seasoned with herbs that grew among the ruins, and cakes baked over coal fires. The soldiers wrote home about these meals, describing them as both strange and comforting. It was as if two worlds had met, one rebuilding from ashes, and the other realizing that kindness could taste like home. Some villages began holding small gatherings where civilians and soldiers cooked together. These were not grand feasts, but quiet celebrations of peace. People traded ingredients, exchanged simple recipes, and shared laughter that transcended language. The Germans called it Friedenbrot, bread of peace. Meatloaf, the heart of the American table. If there's one dish that could define the soul of mid-century American dinners, it's the humble meatloaf. In the 1940s and 50s, this hearty loaf wasn't just food, it was family, comfort, and resourcefulness baked into one pan. When times were uncertain and money was tight, meatloaf became a culinary symbol of survival and love. During World War II, meat was rationed, and every scrap counted. Home cooks stretched ground beef with breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even oatmeal to make it last longer. Leftover vegetables were mixed in, and a glaze of ketchup or tomato soup on top gave it a glossy, irresistible finish. Every slice told the story of a nation that refused to waste, turning simplicity into satisfaction. After the war, as prosperity returned, meatloaf didn't fade away. Instead, it became a Sunday dinner staple across the country. Families gathered around the table, and that familiar aroma filled kitchens from coast to coast. Each household had its own version, some packed with onions and Worcestershire sauce, others sweetened with brown sugar or mustard glaze. It was a dish that adapted to every taste and every budget. But meatloaf was more than a recipe, it was a cultural bridge. It carried the memory of struggle into an age of abundance. It was served in diners, featured in cookbooks, and became the all-American meal in post-war advertisements. Housewives proudly shared their secret recipes, and kids grew up remembering the smell of it baking after school. Even today, the nostalgia of a warm meatloaf dinner brings back the feeling of simpler times, when families talked more, laughed more, and meals were made with love, not convenience. It's not just ground beef and seasoning, it's the story of America, served slice by slice. If you've ever had that one meal that felt like home, you understand what meatloaf meant to those generations. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. It was a reminder that even the most ordinary ingredients, when shared with care, could create something timeless. So next time you crave comfort, remember the dish that fed a nation through hard times and triumphs, the legendary American meatloaf.